Hello to everybody. Hi. So I have to tell you, when the lecture was postponed till today, I thought I would be getting up and lecturing to nobody. Then I heard that there's this crazy rumor that somehow or other, Lin-Manuel Miranda is coming today, and I'm sorry to say he is not. However, allow me to say that before I even knew that was a rumor, I have planted Hamilton trivia in the lecture. I did, I swear, from the musical. And there's good Hamilton stories, so I'm sorry. I expect you guys to throw tomatoes. I felt that I needed to be honest. But I promise that I'll make you all proud. Yes, that is a Hamilton lyric that I just offered you. I will make you proud with my lecture. Okay? Okay. It's always good to start a lecture with the entire room going, oh. Okay. So, and I mean, come on, we got good stuff to talk about here. I'll come to this eventually. Okay. So on Tuesday, I talked about the early 1790s when precedents generally and presidential precedents particularly were really being wrestled with. This didn't stop in the mid and late 1790s. More conflicts, more confusion were added to it. So as you're going to be seeing in today's lecture, as we head into the mid to late 1790s, we're going to be talking about a period of extreme conflict, a string of conflicts during which different visions of the Republic really came into open conflict. This is a big bunch of crises we're going to be talking about today. And it's going to end with an election that seemed as though it was a referendum about the outcome of all of these crises and about American democracy as a whole. Okay, now let's start by talking about the very different visions for the nation that were clashing at the time. And it's important to state, and many of you probably, I certainly in school was taught this, that the period somehow breaks down into Hamilton versus Jefferson. How many of you were taught in one way or another when you learned about the 1790s, Hamilton versus Jefferson? Okay, a lot of you. Okay, so before I talk about Hamilton and Jefferson, I want to say that although there were two really conflicting visions for the Republic, things didn't neatly divide that way. That said, I'm going to outline for you what Hamilton and his particular friends, which is what the Federalists were called, what they thought, and what Jefferson and his particular friends, which is what the Jeffersonian Republicans were called. I'm going to outline what they thought very briefly. Okay, so on the one hand, on the Hamilton and friends side, there's a vision for the future of the nation where it's more manufacturing-based, it's more mercantile, England-loving, and favoring a much stronger central national government. And as we're about to see in a minute, Hamilton's financial plans pretty much promoted this. This is basically the Federalist point of view. On the other hand, others wanted a more agrarian nation with a weaker central government and states retaining much of the power, and they were more French-loving, and that, very generally speaking, I know that these folks are like spinning in their grave at how much I'm summing all this up, but still, that's pretty much what the Jeffersonian Republicans thought. Now, as the pieces of Hamilton's plan began to fall into place in the early 1790s, and I'm talking about things like having the national government assume state debts from the Revolution, so when people wanted to be repaid, they looked to the national government and not state governments, and things like creating a national bank. When these things started falling into place, opposition to the direction of Hamilton's policies began to rise, and you can see that in some of the readings for this week. You can see that when Jefferson and Madison and their buddies saw where Hamilton's policies seemed to be leading, helping government money men, actually Jefferson used the phrase money men, Jefferson and Madison and their allies essentially went to war against Hamilton, his allies, and his policies. Now, the short version of what I'm saying here is that by 1792, you're beginning to have two political alliances, not organized parties, I'm going to come back to that idea in a minute, but political alliances engaged in political warfare because of the clashing views of the nation's future, and things, as we'll see in the lecture, get a lot worse as the 1790s progress. Because as we're about to see, to a large degree, foreign affairs fueled the crisis in domestic politics. Now, it's important to note that foreign affairs and domestic affairs were not two entirely separate things in the early republic as we assume they are today. A foreign power could easily just swallow the whole nation up, or corrupt its politics and politicians with bribes and influence, or shape its national culture in some kind of old world way and encourage aristocratical sentiments, or rouse up the populace by ranting about liberty and revolution, as in France, which was falling into its own revolution. You get a sense of all of this entanglement of domestic and foreign affairs in a quote from Madison in the period. He said, quote, "Most of our political evils may be traced up to our commercial ones, as most of our moral may be to our political. It's one big bundle of things that are adding up to a sense of crisis." Or as Jeffersonian Republican Virginian John Taylor of Caroline put it, quote, this is a spicier quote, "Nothing can save us from an Anglo-monarchic aristocratic military government." One big blob of angst on the part of the Jeffersonian Republicans. Okay, so in many ways, one major theme of this course is the formation of an American national character, for better and worse, and in the early Republic, when the nation was new and untried and still forming, foreign affairs could have a major shaping influence on national character, as well as on national politics, national trade, national expansion, and any number of other things. So in essence, throughout the 1790s, as we'll see, relations with foreign nations were testing and fleshing out the American government, testing the power of the president, determining the power of the American people in matters of policy, and revealing how to appeal effectively to the public for political purposes. Now, you can get a sense of what this feeling, the fear of foreign influence, felt like by looking at a memo that Alexander Hamilton actually wrote to himself. He never did anything with it, but for some bizarre reason, he decided in the mid-1790s to create what he thought could be a national seal for the United States. I do not know why. And this is a document that people tend to ignore because they don't necessarily know what it is. And I can't describe it without acting it out a little bit for you. So I did this once in front of a high school, and they congratulated me for doing modern dance in front of the high school. But you'll see. So Hamilton says, national seal. Imagine a globe. And on one side of the globe, the continent of Europe, and on the other side, North America. And in Europe stands a colossus, a giant, looming towards North America with her foot just above North America, wearing all kinds of French revolutionary garb. And meanwhile, in North America, there's a figure that represents liberty with a shield doing this. Okay, Hamilton says, national seal. They're coming to get us. That's his kind of weird Freudian image of what he thought encapsulated America at that time. It's kind of bonkers, and yet I love it. Now, part of what Hamilton is really panicking about in this drawing is the impact of the French Revolution. And in fact, the French Revolution had a huge impact on early national American politics. Federalists, like Hamilton, were afraid of the unsettling, disorganizing, democratizing social influence that it might have on American society. Republicans identified with the ideals of revolutionary France and this idea that the spark of liberty was spreading around the globe. Okay, so I just skipped 5 pages. So Page 3. Okay, 4. The impact of these ideals, the impact of this idea that the spark of liberty was spreading around the globe, sparked the birth of a kind of club throughout parts of the United States in 1793 and 1794 called Democratic Republican Societies. They were political clubs of a sort. They often rallied behind Jefferson and proclaimed their friendship with revolutionary France. So we're looking at kind of a new form of public political expression. Now, obviously, the Federalists are not going to be thrilled with this development. They were no more thrilled with the idea that the public protested against an excise tax on whiskey that Hamilton passed in 1794. So Hamilton thought, okay, we're going to pass this tax on domestically produced whiskey, and we'll use it to pay back national debts. But farmers who distilled their corn into whiskey to transport it to market would have their profits pretty much wiped out by that tax. So in 1794, farmers who were hit particularly hard by the tax in western Pennsylvania began to resist it in the way they knew best. So they protested against unfair taxes. They tarred and feathered some tax collectors. They damaged the barns and houses of some revenue officers. Think back, stamp tax, right? There's echoes here of what people do when they're angry and protesting against the government. So here we have a surge of resistance to a federal tax. Some people even wondered if this rebellion, this whiskey, what comes to be known as the Whiskey Rebellion, had been inspired by those Democratic Republican societies. And Washington, in private, actually said that he thought that the Whiskey Rebellion was, quote, the first ripe fruit of those Democratic Republican societies. Organize resistance to the new government. So what do you think the national government does? They essentially called out the army and marched them on the whiskey rebels. Partly with Hamilton's urging, Washington decided to nip this spirit of resistance in the bud. If he didn't, he and Hamilton both feared that the new national government wouldn't seem to have any authority at all. So roughly 13,000 militiamen from Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia, and New Jersey marched west to quell this so-called Whiskey Rebellion. Now, the Secretary of War, Henry Knox, was out of town at the time. So who do you think was at the head of troops with Washington marching out to quell those whiskey rebels? The Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, who now suddenly was also acting Secretary of War. And the letter that you read for this week about Hamilton writing to Angelica and saying, I am just off now to march against the wicked insurgents of the West. This is a gleeful Hamilton who's like, they're against the government. I'm going to quash them now. Now, here is a piece of Hamilton trivia. I don't know who or if any of you saw it before it made it to Broadway, but there were a couple changes in songs or lyrics between the Public Theater and Broadway, and one of them involves the Whiskey Rebellion. So off Broadway, there was actually a song about the Whiskey Rebellion, believe it or not. The song that we now know of as One Last Time was One Last Ride. It was Hamilton and Washington, one last ride to destroy the whiskey rebels. And when I saw the musical, and I got to go backstage, and I wanted to congratulate Lin-Manuel Miranda on the show, and he looked profoundly, this is when it was on Broadway, and it was gone. When it went on Broadway, One Last Ride was gone, it was One Last Time. I went back to congratulate him, Broadway, very exciting, and he looked really worried. And he said to me, I'm really sorry, I had to eliminate the Whiskey Rebellion. He said, the theater just died during the Whiskey Rebellion. No one knew what it was. I'm so sorry. And he somehow thought that I would be like, I shall never come to this theater ever again. The Whiskey Rebellion is gone. But it initially had its moment in the Hamilton musical. Okay, now ultimately, the Whiskey Rebellion fizzled. it was further proof that the American people were very riled up. You join this with the Democratic Republican societies, and there really seemed to be some serious questions about popular political expression in the new republic. How was American popular politics supposed to work? When did popular resistance grow into what looked like or seemed like a second revolution and become dangerous? That's the kind of question that Federalists were asking. Now, Washington gave his response to some of these questions in his annual message to Congress in 1794, where he denounced Democratic Republican societies, calling them, quote, dangerous, self-created societies. And that phrase, self-created societies, is worth looking at for a moment. Because by criticizing self-created societies, Washington is condemning political organizations that claimed to somehow be representing the people, but were outside of the realm of the Constitution and beyond the intentions of the people who framed the government. So when he says self-created, he's kind of saying self-elected, that these societies are like alien interlopers violating the way institutionalized governments are supposed to work. So ultimately, by linking the Whiskey Rebellion and with the Democratic Republican societies and saying all of them are against the Constitution, Washington contributed to the downfall of the Democratic Republican Society movement as a whole. You can see why, at this point, Jefferson and Madison, this is Washington's second term, became convinced that Washington had become a Federalist partisan who was opposed to ongoing popular participation in government. Madison later called Washington's denouncing of self-created societies, these democratic republic societies, as, quote, the greatest error of Washington's political life. Okay, now, at this point, Washington is getting a little bit of unpopularity. Washington wasn't good with unpopularity. This probably doesn't surprise you much. And thanks to Thomas Jefferson, we have a verbatim response from Washington when he saw a political cartoon criticizing him. As you can tell by this point, when there are moments when I can bring in some of my favorite stories, I totally bring in some of my favorite stories, and this is one. So his second term, people are becoming critical. There's a cartoon being sold in the streets of Washington on a guillotine with his head on the guillotine, right? And I don't even know what it said, the wording of it, but it was like, who is this guy? He's against liberty. And Henry Knox, the Secretary of War, who's a little bit of a goofy guy, brings it in and says, hey, you guys, did you see this? Into a cabinet meeting. Okay, according to Jefferson, and this is all a quote, Washington got much inflamed, got into one of those passions when he cannot command himself, ran on much on the personal abuse which had been bestowed on him, defied any man on earth to produce one single act of his since he had been in the government, which was not done on the purest motives, that he had never repented but once, having slipped the moment of resigning the office after his first term, and that was every moment since he took the office he repented having taken it. That by God, he'd rather be in his grave than in his present situation. He'd rather be on his farm than be made emperor of the world. And yet they were charging him with wanting to be a king. He goes on and on and on. You can kind of sense the rant. My favorite part of this is what Jefferson writes next. So Washington is just tearing a hole in the walls with his ranting. At the end of this, Jefferson writes, there was a pause. Some difficulty resuming our conversation. And you can just feel in the room, after he does that rant, you've been in a situation like this, where suddenly everyone's like, oh. So that was one of those moments. So we're looking at foreign and domestic uproars. We're seeing fundamental questions about the working of the American state and the nature of its citizenry. We've seen an extreme response on the part of the national government, which brings us to a core part of what Jefferson ultimately called, and I mentioned this on Tuesday, the reign of witches, the late 1790s. Between 1796 and 1800, under President John Adams, who assumed the presidency in 1797, crises continued to erupt, each building on the previous one, until, as the nation approached the presidential election of 1800, many people felt that America's experiment in government might be on the verge of collapse. And this period of extreme politics was set off by, surprise, surprise, the French reaction to the Jay Treaty. I talked about Tuesday, rocks being thrown at Hamilton's head. The public didn't like the Jay Treaty, but the Jay Treaty was friendly towards England. France didn't like that very much, so they began messing with American merchant ships in the Caribbean. Now, throughout this period, foreign affairs were a really intense challenge for the new nation, particularly concerning England and France, who were longtime enemies. When the United States diplomatically smiled at one, the other very often would attack the United States in some way, and then the United States would turn around and try and make nice with the other, and the first one would attack the United States in front way. So the United States is kind of a ping-pong ball between England and France throughout this period. So given that the French are messing with American merchant ships, President Adams sent 3 men to negotiate a treaty with France: John Marshall, Elbridge Gerry. Elbridge Gerry, who is the man who named gerrymandering, and his name is Gary, and yet we call it gerrymandering. I offer you that piece of trivia for your own personal use. And Charles Pinckney. And they arrived in Paris in 1797, and they were soon met by 3 somewhat mysterious Frenchmen working for French Minister Talleyrand. The 3 mysterious Frenchmen were later designated in American documents as X, Y, and Z. And they demanded 2 things before any negotiations could begin between the United States and France. So number 1, they wanted America to supply a big loan to help France's war effort, just like that. And number 2, they wanted a really big bribe to be given to French Minister Talleyrand. Now, not surprisingly, the 3 American ambassadors were outraged. They assumed that France was treating the United States like some kind of backwater country where you could just demand bribes, and of course, they would be given. Now, in truth, to some degree, that was the nature of American diplomacy generally in this period. And in France, sometimes you offered a little bribe to smooth things over, and most nations paid that and then basically got on with business. So it's American inexperience more than anything else that complicated matters here. So outraged at these demands, the American Commission refused them, and when the details of this got back to the United States, it became known as the appropriately named XYZ affair. And there was a loud public outcry against what people saw as an insult against American honor. And of course, an outcry that was encouraged by Federalist leaders and Federalist newspapermen who played up the scandal in the press to make the French, and thus Republicans, look bad. Okay, so now the Federalists are riding high and the public seems to be with them. John Adams, for the first time in his life, is traveling around the nation, giving public speeches, and he's being cheered by thousands. He was thrilled. He'd never been cheered before in his life. Now, not surprisingly, given the direction that things are flowing, Federalists launched hostilities against the French, beginning what became known as the quasi-war. So there actually is never a real war. There's actually never any real combat. This isn't really a war, which is why it's called the quasi-war with France. The nation didn't want to fight a full-blown war against the French. The United States is still new, it's really weak, but the United States had to do something to protect American shipping and the American economy. And as we'll see, hostilities against France helped the Federalists by hurting the Republicans. Okay, so there we got the quasi-war. We got anti-French sentiment raging. We got John Adams being cheered as a hero in the middle of all this. And at this key moment, the Federalists pushed their lead and made a move while the iron was hot, so to speak. They did this partly because they were worried about French revolutionaries worming their way and their influence into America through French-loving Republicans, and partly because with these hostilities towards France, the Federalists recognized a great opportunity to crush their opponents, the France-loving Jeffersonian Republicans. So in essence, the Federalists used a seeming, but not quite existing threat against America to start crushing their opposition, of course, hoping to help their party in the process. And it's in that spirit to slash at French influence, French intervention, and French-loving Republicans that Federalists passed the repressive Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798. Now, the Alien Acts, which were actually 3 combined acts, were aimed at stemming the flow and influence of immigrants in the United States. People who might have dangerous ideas or links with France, and who were likely to become Jeffersonian Republicans. The 3 Alien Acts established a registration and surveillance system for foreign nationals in the US and gave the president extensive powers over them, including the right to deport any foreigner who he considered dangerous to national security. Instant deportation of dangerous foreign nationals as seen by the president. The Sedition Act declared it illegal to write or say seditious things about the national government or its officers. And although the act was supposedly intended to protect the government during a time of war when national security was at risk, it defined criminal activity, it defined sedition so broadly that it seemed to ban legitimate political discussion as well. It forbade individuals or groups from, quote, opposing any measure or measures of the United States. And music came down from the heavens. So the Sedition Act forbade individuals or groups from opposing measures of the United States, wording that could be interpreted to ban any criticism of those in power. Okay, where is the music coming from? Outside? Okay. I can't sing, so I can't go longer. Another clause of the Sedition Act made it illegal to speak, write, or print any statement about the president that would bring him into contempt or disrepute. Under these restrictions, a newspaper editor could be imprisoned just for disapproving of one of President Adams' actions or those of his cabinet. Now, the Federalists, of course, argued that these policies, deporting foreigners, silencing criticism against the government, that they were protecting national security. By Federalist logic, by attacking Federalist leaders, particularly national Federalist leaders at a time of war or quasi-war, the Republican press was destroying the authority and legitimacy of the fledgling national government just when it was needed. So essentially, the Federalists are arguing that if you humiliate and disgrace Federalist leaders during a time of war, you're weakening the government, which doesn't have much power beyond the personal authority of its leaders. The government was too weak and too new to have any clout of its own, according to this logic. But even as the Federalists said that all of these acts were about national security, they knew and wanted to use them to crush the opposition, in particular the Republican press. The Federalists in power wanted to silence the Republican press and criticism of the government. They didn't say it publicly, but they said it to each other. So you can see how focused the Federalists were on the Republican press by looking at the victims of the Sedition Act. Federalists really began to enforce that act as we're heading into the presidential election of 1800, ultimately bringing charges of sedition against newspapermen working for 4 of the 5 largest Republican newspapers. The point of this is pretty clear. So basically, the Federalists, who had the presidency and had a majority in Congress in the late 1790s, used a quasi-crisis to attack their opposition by silencing criticism and deporting people who were likely to become Republicans. Now, it's really important to note that passing those acts doesn't mean Federalists had unquestioned control. There was opposition in the government and among the people at large. And you can see that in a kind of dramatic format in a clash in Congress between a Federalist and a Republican. So with partisanship rising to an extreme in the late 1790s, lo and behold, it broke out in the House of Representatives. So this is a cartoon depicting the House of Representatives. Roger Griswold, a Federalist from Connecticut, so he is on the right, accused Matthew Lyon, a Republican from Vermont, that pesky state of Vermont, of being a coward during the American Revolution. Lyon responded by spitting in Griswold's face, thereby earning the name the Spitting Lion. Griswold responded by beating Lyon with his cane. Lyon responded by grabbing the fireplace tongs and smacking back at Griswold. So what you're seeing is on the right, Griswold with his cane, and on the left, Lyon with the fireplace tongs. Now, what I love about this cartoon and why I wanted to use it is, look what's happening around them, right? There's like some guy basically cheering it on. There's someone looking a little confused. I don't know why there's a dog lurking on the floor, but it's like the people in the room are partly amused, partly shocked. At one point in my research, I found a letter from someone sitting there, writing to his wife as that happened. Which, you know, if you're a historian and you find people who are like, I am writing, and then, oh, look, a historic moment is happening. So he's writing to his wife about how things are going, I'm in Congress, life is fine. And then you can see he put his pen down, and then he picks his pen up and he says, you won't believe what just happened. I'm writing to you, and then I heard this thump of wood hitting fabric. And I looked up, and he sees this, right? He sees what's happening, and of course he thinks part of what I'm saying here is like, holy smoke, what's going on in Congress? Now, importantly, and probably not surprisingly, number one, I'm showing this because it shows the high passions of partisan conflict at the time, but also the Federalists were thrilled that Griswold was beating a Republican. As one Federalist wrote to Griswold, go on, my dear Federalists, bang these fellows out. It's for good reason here. You're looking at the building of extreme partisanship. It's for good reason that when I'm asked, just generally when I'm speaking in public about extreme partisanship in American history, I talk about the 1850s and I talk about the late 1790s. It's another really extreme period. In the end, it was this kind of repressive politicking, this kind of violent partisanship, and the extreme Federalist attempts to silence their opposition that drove Jefferson to brand this period the reign of witches. And the phrase comes from a 1798 letter that he wrote to a fellow Virginian who suggested that maybe the South should just secede from the Union. And Jefferson responded by saying that, quote, with a little patience, we shall see the reign of witches pass over, their spells dissolve, and the people recovering their true sight restore their government to its true principles. So so he's saying, it's all going to get better. I do have to note, he said that before the passage of the Alien and Sedition Acts. He might have spoken a little differently after that point. So with those extreme acts, the Federalists empowered the national government to an extreme, even giving it power over acts of protest in print, once again acting in line with their general nervousness about democratic politics and how they feared that sweeping democratic politics, the people out in the streets, popular protest, might overturn the government. Federalists had this kind of fear because throughout this period, Americans of all kinds, as we've already heard a bit, were figuring out gradually how a democratic politics might work, how they could best vent their voices and how far popular protest might go. This process of exploration by the people and the Alien and Sedition Acts also hint at a growing Federalist realization in the late 1790s. The realization that the new nation seemed to be moving in a direction, seemingly maybe a more democratic direction, that they didn't like very much. As one Federalist said right around this time period, the national government is small r Republican, grounded on representation. The American people are small d Democratic, eager to personally involve themselves in the political process on an ongoing basis. And according to this Federalist, one or the other is going to have to change, the government or the people, or the whole thing is going to fall. So the Federalists kind of feel that they're swimming upstream, at least for the present. Hamilton, a few years from this point, when he can see the direction that things are going, he actually, I signed it this week, he writes a letter saying, "This American world was not meant for me." He can see that things are going in a direction that not what he intended. So the Federalists can kind of sense they're swimming upstream, and as power holders do when they see political demographics are against them to hold on to power, they become even more extreme and repressive. To Republicans, Federalists were clearly trying to convert the nation into a monarchy and to silence the American people. So faced with what they saw as a fundamental threat to the core of the Republic and out of power on a national level, the Republicans shifted strategy. They moved their fight from the national level to the state level. As Jefferson later put it, the leading Republicans in Congress who found themselves of no use there decided to retire from that field, take a stand in their state legislatures, and endeavor there to arrest the progress of Federalist domination. The centerpiece of this new strategy for the Republicans was the idea of what they called state interposition, meaning state governments intervening when the national government went too far and violated the Constitution. So along those lines, in August of 1798, Jefferson summed up this idea in what would become known as the Kentucky Resolutions. Jefferson argued that the national government was the product of a compact among the states under a constitution with certain defined powers. But aside from those defined powers, each state reserved to itself the residual mass of rights. So basically, the Constitution has certain things in it. What is not in it is reserved for the states. And as in all compacts, everyone who was part of this constitutional pact had an equal right to judge for itself when that compact had been violated. So by this logic, if the Alien and Sedition Acts were unconstitutional, then individual states had a perfect right to declare them unconstitutional and prevent them from being exercised in that state. That's pretty radical. Jefferson drafted the Kentucky Resolutions. Madison drafted the Virginia Resolutions along the same lines. Really radical. What they're basically saying is that states can nullify national laws that seem unconstitutional. Jefferson, in his original draft of the Kentucky Resolutions, actually used the word nullify, which he took out in the final draft. Madison said that states can interpose and block federal action. Now, in the end, no other state went along with these ideas, and in fact, some states really opposed them. But the passage of these resolutions really shows how dire and extreme circumstances were becoming. Hamilton, who was eternally prone to saying and doing extreme things, part of the reason I started studying him in the first place is because he's so extreme and he does such over-the-top things. I wanted to understand how they made sense to him. It's pretty consistent over his whole life. So he's always doing things that he probably shouldn't do and saying things he probably shouldn't say. In this case, at this moment, Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, he wrote to a friend saying that the army should be marched into Virginia to, quote, put the legislature in Virginia to the test of resistance. Like, okay, so Virginia, you think you're going to stand up to the government? Let's march the army on them. I assigned that letter this week. That shows sort of where he is in his belief that what's happening on a state level is going to topple the national government. He has a very extreme point of view at this point. So in the last year or two of the 1790s, what you see building is a kind of crisis mentality, a sense on each side that they were a band of patriots driven to take increasingly desperate actions to fight arbitrary power and the threat of disunion brought on by the other side. You have Republicans who are shocked at the Alien and Sedition Acts. You have Federalists who are equally shocked at the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. Now that's a lot of political adrenaline flowing around in a very short amount of time. And in one way or another, all of these things involved major central issues in American society, politics, and nationhood. Making matters worse was the fact that the Federalists and Republicans sensed a threat to the Republic, and the more they sensed that threat, the more organized they got in their efforts, so that they began to look increasingly like political parties. And political parties were considered a bad, bad thing. We assume, of course, that organized national parties and party conflict is something of a norm for the American political system, the center of our political system. In this early period, parties seemed to be a sign of a really serious problem. The national political system was supposed to provide a kind of meeting place for conflicting interests to come together and clash, and ultimately, ideally, come up with a shared solution that best served the national public good. Organized national political parties were a sign that people weren't thinking about the national good, they were promoting themselves and their friends instead. Now this brings us to the election of 1800, definitely another crisis. Now as we head into this election, it's important to note that in 1800, as in 1796, the electoral process worked differently than it does now that we have the 12th Amendment to the Constitution. In 1796 and 1800, electors in each state decided on their two favorite candidates, but they had no way to designate one as their presidential candidate and the other as their vice presidential candidate. So what would happen is the electors would pick two people, you would put all of those elector candidate votes together, and whoever had the most votes would become president, and whoever had the second most votes would become vice president. Because of that, in 1796, you had a Federalist president, John Adams, and a Republican vice president, Thomas Jefferson. So clearly, this is not a system that considered the development of political parties. Now, in 1800, things got worse, because after a really close and contentious contest, full of panic and desperation, there was a tie vote between the two Republican candidates. Jefferson, supposedly the Republican presidential candidate, and Aaron Burr, supposedly the Republican vice presidential candidate, ended up with the exact same number of electoral votes. Now, in such a case, according to the Constitution, the election gets thrown to the House of Representatives, which has to vote state by state, each state getting one vote, to decide who wins. Now, Republicans, who assumed that, of course, the nation wanted Jefferson to be president and Burr for vice president, assumed that Burr would step aside. Oh, you only wanted me for vice president. I shall step aside now that this has happened. But Burr did not do that. The fact of the matter is, Burr wanted to be president. Now, during the outset of the election, Burr had promised he would not compete against Jefferson for the presidency. And in his eyes, once there was a tied vote, he kept his word because he did nothing to say that he wanted the presidency. He also didn't back out and say he didn't want it. He just kind of, thinking of the Hamilton musical, bided his time, waited to see what would happen. The Hamilton musical and its lyrics There are too many ways in which they actually can be deployed in the American language. Okay, so Burr does nothing, and he wants to be president. So you have a tie vote for president, a silent Aaron Burr, a lot of confused Republicans, and a lot of really desperate Federalists who are willing to do anything rather than put Jefferson into the presidency, a man who they truly assumed was a demagogue and a French-loving, philosophical, atheist fanatic, they use all of those words, who would destroy the national government. At this crucial moment, some Federalists who weren't happy with either candidate actually considered just preventing any election at all. They debated usurping the government. Maybe they would declare their own president pro tem. Meanwhile, the tie persisted. Again and again, the House voted, and the tie vote remained. It took 36 ballots to decide the election. For 6 days, the House voted again and again, desperately trying to decide the election. People began to gather outside of the Capitol, wondering if anyone was going to win, wondering if maybe this meant the end of the government. Sick congressmen were carried to the House on cots to help decide the vote. And in Virginia and Pennsylvania, more desperate measures were contemplated. In both of those states, the state legislature and or the governor began to make plans to stockpile guns so that they would be prepared to seize the presidency for Jefferson, in their opinion, the rightful presidential candidate. Okay, so now we have talk of like preventing the election from happening on one side. We have stockpiling arms to seize the government for Jefferson on the other. And interestingly, Jefferson knew about the threats, the guns, the fact that people were saying, you do the wrong thing and there will be violence. He wrote a letter after the election saying that during the tie, leading Republicans let it be known that the wrong outcome during the election would be met by resistance. So it's clear, like this, we think of early America as, I don't know, this, by now you should be following along with me to realize it's not a calm, quiet period, but we don't think of early elections this way, and this election, you can understand why in recent history I've been thinking a lot about the presidential election of 1800. In the end, it was the threat of civil war or disunion that decided the contest. Federalist James Baird of Delaware, the only representative from his state, had his entire state's vote in his hands. And remember, each state had one vote in the House to break the tie. So Bayard's decision all by himself would give a state to one of the candidates. So he considered his options. Making Burr president, as some Federalists were suggesting, might actually lead to civil war and violence and destroy the Union. And yet some Federalists seemed willing to take that risk. Bayard is a Federalist. For Bayard, from the tiny state of Delaware, disunion seemed like a very, very bad idea. As he explained after the election, representing the smallest state, I call it tiny, he called it smallest. Representing the smallest state in the Union without resources which could furnish the means of self-protection, I was compelled by the obligation of a sacred duty so to act as not to hazard the Constitution upon which the political existence of my state depends. So in other words, disunion would leave the little state of Delaware unprotected. It could be swallowed up by another state or another country. So Bayard allowed Jefferson to win and convinced a few Federalists to do likewise. Though significantly, no Federalist actually voted for Jefferson. They just strategically withheld their votes and allowed Jefferson to get enough of a majority to win. Okay, so where does this leave us? What does Jefferson's victory mean? And what was the status of government power and democracy as the United States entered the 19th century? Well, one obvious thing that it meant, and this is a local story, it means the fall of the Federalists on a national level. The Federalists lingered on a state level. They lingered longest of all in Connecticut. And the Federalist center of Connecticut was Yale University. We are in Federalist center here. So they lingered, they were angry, but they weren't going to have national power again. More significantly, in many ways, Jefferson's victory was a kind of referendum towards a more democratic ethos of politics, though not democratic by our standards. And it's vital to note here, for a while historians were saying, well, there were evil Federalists, and then the democratic Jefferson came along, and the world was safe for democracy. And I am not saying that, because obviously Jefferson and his party are not cheering for democracy as we understand it. But the Federalists were defeated. There was a signal here of a national drift in a different direction. Next Tuesday, we'll see a far greater change in the ethos of American politics. We'll see kind of a new flavor of a democratic politics. Again, still not democratic by modern standards, but what we're going to see is Andrew Jackson, who brings with him the rise of real party politics and a celebration of a kind of democracy, limited to certain people for sure, but a really different understanding of democracy and how politics in America should work. Thank you guys for sticking here with me, even though Lin-Manuel Miranda didn't come. Thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Whew. Oh, wait a minute, guys. So I texted the fact to Lin-Manuel Miranda that you guys all thought he was coming. And apparently he responded with a string of laughing emoji. So we have been recognized.